brought on by the COVID pandemic, which temporarily closed manufacturing plants and clogged supply chains. But there is a hidden contributor to the high prices we will pay on everything from furniture to eggs, credit card swipe fees. Every time an American consumer makes a purchase using a credit card, a swipe fee is taken out of the transaction amount and divided between the credit card network and the bank that issued the card. The biggest part of the swipe fee is called the interchange fee, which is set by credit card network and paid to the issuing bank. The credit card market is dominated by Visa and Mastercard. They control 83% of credit cards in this country. These networks can set interchange fees at seemingly whatever amount they wish. Retailers, restaurants, and other small businesses have no ability to negotiate these fees, which can run anywhere from 1% to 3% of the total bill. The only choice, if you want to call it that, they have is to accept Visa and Mastercard branded credit cards and pay the fee, or refuse to accept the cards entirely, which in this day and age is no choice at all for most retailers. Let's turn to a video that sheds light on this issue.
It's easier than ever to tap, insert, or swipe your card and go, but every time you do, a small percentage of that sale is taken from that business. These are called swipe fees or interchange fees. It's how much Visa, Mastercard, and other card networks charge a merchant when a customer uses a credit card to make a purchase.
These fees are my second highest operating expense. So my first highest is obviously payroll with all of my people, and my second highest is my credit card fees that total almost $100,000 a year.
So on average, sometimes it's a flat 10-cent fee plus 2.6% of a transaction. So let's say you're spending about $10, it's about 27 cents, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it adds up for so many small business owners that have smaller profit margins. In the United States, some of those fees are some of the highest in the world.
Why are swipe fees in the US 9 times higher than they are in Europe? Why do we have to pay so much just to pay? Well, it's largely thanks to two companies, Visa and Mastercard. But these two companies control over 80% of the credit card market. With scant competition, Visa and Mastercard have faced little pressure to rein in swipe fees. The truth is, for the vast majority of Americans, the best deal might not come in the form of a new piece of plastic, but instead, a new piece of legislation.
The bill would require larger banks to offer merchants at least two choices for payment processing networks. Visa and Mastercard can account for only one of those choices, giving retailers options for networks with smaller processing fees.
In this room, during a Senate Judiciary Committee hearing held in 2006. In the 18 years since that hearing, American consumers have been charged a staggering $1.1 trillion in interchange fees. The vast majority of those fees, a total of $797 billion, came from credit card purchases. The remaining $320 billion, less than a third of the total, comes from debit cards. There's a simple explanation for that disparity. In 2010, the Senate voted to include what became known as the Durbin Amendment in the Dodd-Frank Act. The Durbin Amendment capped the interchange fees that card networks like Visa and Mastercard could set on behalf of large debit card issuing banks. This single reform is estimated to have saved consumers $6 billion. $6 billion in the first year after its implementation, and billions more since. I want to salute a former staffer of mine, Dan Swanson, who's here today in the front row. He led me on this journey from the beginning, and I thank you for your service. Thanks for being here, Dan. Free of similar regulation in the credit card market, Visa and Mastercard Duopoly virtually prints money on behalf of their big bank partners. In 2023 alone, Visa and Mastercard charge merchants more than $100 billion in credit card fees, mostly in the form of interchange fees. But help is on the way. In July of 2022, I joined my colleague, Senator Roger Marshall, who will speak to us this morning, to introduce the Bipartisan Credit Card Competition Act. Senators Welch, Hawley, Reid, and Vice President-elect Vance have signed on as co-sponsors of our bill. I welcome them to this fight. The Credit Card Competition Act would break the Visa MasterCard stranglehold on the market by requiring only the largest banks, those with more than $100 billion in assets, the only banks that are affected, more than $100 billion in assets, to enable two networks on their cards, and one must be a company other than Visa and MasterCard. In this way, small businesses would finally have a real choice. They could route credit card transactions on the Visa or MasterCard network and continue to pay interchange fees that often rank as their second or biggest expense, or they could select a lower cost alternative. It's something called competition. I have a pretty good idea which one they'll choose. With downward pressure on these exorbitant interchange fees, more money will flow to local restaurants, bookstores, and shops that we all frequent. Where the big banks use interchange fees to pad profit margins of 30% or more, small businesses with tight profit margins, often as low as 3 to 5%, will use their savings to hire more workers, invest in their businesses, or heaven forbid, actually lower prices. No matter their choice, we all benefit. We are joined by a distinguished panel of witnesses who will be able to shed more light on the role interchange fees play. But before I turn to them and to Senator Graham, who will be here shortly, I understand, I want to recognize my colleague, Senator Roger Marshall, Republican senator from Kansas. He is a co-sponsor of the act, and I want to give him a chance to have a few minutes to tell us why you did it. Roger.
Thank you, Chairman Durbin, and all the committee members for giving me this opportunity. Swipe fees are inflation multipliers. Let me say that again. Swipe fees are inflation multipliers. Now, I'm honored to join this committee to fight for hardworking Americans and Main Street businesses across America. And today, I urge this committee to choose Main Street over Wall Street, to stand with American consumers instead of multi-billion-dollar corporations. Now, here's the facts. The average American family spends over $1,100 annually on swipe fees, $1,100. In the United States, swipe fees are over 9 times higher than in the EU, 4 times higher than China, and twice that of Canada. Last year alone, the retailers paid over $170 billion in swipe fees. For small businesses, these fees are second only to labor cost, often exceeding utilities or even healthcare expenses for their employees. Meanwhile, the average credit card interest rate has soared to 24%. 24% interest rate on your credit cards, and late fees have added another $14 billion of cost to consumers. When it's all said and done, for retailers and consumers, together the cost is almost $300 billion annually, which amounts to over $2,200 per family. Additionally, Visa operates as a virtual monopoly. At least that's what the DOJ is accusing them of, working in tandem with Mastercard, partnering with a number of Wall Street mega banks, and thus controlling over 80% of the market. Is there anything fair about this? Now, there are some misconceptions being spread by opponents of this legislation, and I'd like to set the record straight. First misconception, that this is a price cap on transaction fees. Nothing could be further from the truth. In reality, our bill does not impose price caps. There's no price caps. Instead, it requires issuing banks to offer a second processing platform, which is not Visa or MasterCard. This is going to create competition in the market, which is currently dominated by Visa and MasterCard. Increased competition will reduce costs, which will then be passed on to consumers. Misconception number 2. The legislation compromises security. The opposite is actually true. Our bill increases security for the bank and the consumer. The issuing bank gets to choose the second processor. The issuing bank does, and they'll ensure that they'll select a reliable and secure platform. Additionally, we exclude platforms like China UnionPay and all other non-US based entities. Our bill will actually enhance security by encouraging the adoption of modern, cyber-safe systems, including end-to-end encryption. Misconception 3, this will harm small banks. As the chairman pointed out, we exempt lending institutions with assets under $100 billion. meaning only 30 of the largest financial institutions are affected. Only 30 institutions are affected. Misconception 4, rewards will disappear. In reality, everyone needs to realize that Visa and Mastercard don't issue the rewards. The banks issue the rewards, and it's a marketing game for them. Rewards programs are a tool banks use to attract customers. That's not went away in other countries that have already adopted swipe fee reforms as well. Misconception number 5. The technology doesn't exist to support multiple platforms. Again, that's simply false. There are dozens of competitive networks out there that routinely process debit transactions, and even JP Morgan Chase recently launched a credit card in France with 2 processing platforms. Now, a quick point. I'm especially grateful for this committee allowing the topic to be debated today. We've repeatedly asked, in fact, begged the Banking Committee to hold a hearing, and they haven't answered our request, and I'll let you all decide why. And then I want everyone on the committee to know this. We did a professional survey of several issues back home. Now, this was not a push poll. It was a professional survey. Over 10,000 people returned the survey. And what were the findings? Not 70, not 80, not 90. 96% of the people on this survey support our credit card bill. 96%. And I have to add, when the opponents of this bill have spent over $80 million attacking myself and the chairman and this bill, that's over twice what was spent against me in a Senate race. You know that you're over the target. Let's be clear, whether it's inflation or sales taxes, or in this case, swipe fees, when those go up, consumers ultimately pay the price. The retailers pass those expenses on to consumers. It's that simple. Now, kind of wrapping things up, at my heart, I'm a hands-off, free market capitalist. But capitalism without competition leads to unchecked greed, the exploitation of hardworking Americans, and the erosion of opportunity. Now, I remind everyone that American credit card debt is at an all-time high of over $1 trillion. Unless you feel sorry for these monopolies, Mastercard enjoys a profit margin of over 44% and Visa over 55%. So I ask everyone on this committee and in Congress, why would we stand by and allow Wall Street monopolies to siphon more and more money from our communities back home to enrich themselves? Why wouldn't we, as Teddy Roosevelt once said, try and get everyone, every American, a square deal? When faced with the choice, I'll always side with Main Street over Wall Street and working Americans over monopolistic corporations. Let's all take this opportunity to stand up for the people who get paid by the hour and carry a lunch pail to work. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Marshall. I asked you to keep it at 5 minutes. I think you did that exactly. I appreciate it very much. We're going to have 5 witnesses before this committee, and I'll ask the staff to make the transition here from Senator Marshall to the witnesses. While the witnesses are coming to the table, I'm going to introduce them by reading their backgrounds. Our first witness is going to be Chris Callahan. He and his wife are the owner of Bat and Kill Books, an independent bookstore in Cambridge, New York. Since buying Bat and Kill Books, the Callahans have revitalized the store as a center of the community. Mr. Callahan is also an extension professor of agriculture engineering at the University of Vermont. Senator Welch, glad to have you here this morning. We're also joined by Bill Sheedy. Mr. Sheedy is the senior advisor to Visa's CEO, a position you've held since 2020. Before taking his current role, Mr. Sheedy worked as executive vice president of Visa's corporate strategy group, president of Visa's Americas region, and board member of Visa Europe, among other positions. Our next witness is Linda Kirkpatrick. Thank you for being here. President of Americas region for Mastercard. She is responsible for overseeing Mastercard's operations and consumer-facing activities in the United States, Canada, and Latin America. She has been with Mastercard since 1997, has held various roles during her tenure. Next, we are joined by Roger Alford, a professor of law at Notre Dame, where his scholarship focuses on antitrust, competition, trade, and other commercial law issues. Professor Alford previously served as Deputy Assistant Attorney General for International Affairs with the Antitrust Division of the U.S. Department of Justice. Our final witness is Doug Cantor. Since 2021, Mr. Cantor has served as General Counsel for the National Association of Convenience Stores, organization representing 148,000 convenience stores. Organization represents employing more than 2.3 million people across the country. Mr. Cantor previously practiced law at Steptoe Johnson, where he served as counsel to the Merchant Payments Coalition, among other organizations. Excuse me. I ask the witnesses to please stand and be sworn in. If you'd raise your right hand. Do you affirm the testimony you're about to give before this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record reflect that all 5 witnesses thankfully answered in the affirmative. And we are going to proceed. And the first one up is my bookseller. I have a particular affection for bookstores, Chris Callahan.
Thank you. Chairman Durbin, Ranking Member Graham, and members of the committee, thank you for giving me this chance to testify today. As Chairman Durbin noted, my wife and I own Bat and Kill Books in Cambridge, New York. Cambridge is a small town near the border of Vermont, where a small business in a small town, and honestly, sometimes it's a struggle to make it work. But we're proud that our store is vibrant, part of a main street in our community, and we want to keep it that way. When we bought the business in 2009, we moved it into a historic Main Street building, which we had just renovated. We tripled the store's footprint. We were idealistic and excited, maybe a little naive. We've used local banks to help us with financing the renovation and with a line of credit to weather seasonal cash flow variation. This past Sunday, 15 years since doing that renovation and moving in, we made our last payment on that commercial mortgage. And we use credit cards to make store purchases. So I offer all of that to say we're not anti-bank. We're not anti-credit card. We love access to capital. It's helped our business be successful. My point here today is to emphasize that credit card swipe fees are a significant burden to all merchants, but especially harmful to small businesses like mine that pay higher rates than our competitors because of the way that Visa and Mastercard set the fees. There are Band-Aid solutions, such as consumer surcharges and baking the fees into our product prices, but the Credit Card Competition Act represents a much-needed solution that would provide a cure for the market failure and improve the payments system for all those involved, including merchants and consumers. While we've seen many costs go up for our business, credit card fees have been the toughest to handle. I'm here to tell you that something needs to change. Main Street businesses like mine cannot take it any longer. When business is fair and the market is free, Connie and I can hold our own. But that is not how it is for credit card fees. The duopoly of Visa and Mastercard fixes the interchange fee rates that the banks and credit unions that offer credit cards charge us. We can't deal effectively with all those banks and credit unions banding together to fix fees. And then Visa and Mastercard add even more network fees on top of that. And those fees keep going up too. All we're asking is for a little competition so we can deal with these businesses the way we deal with our other suppliers. Give us a chance, we'll do our part. If you let things keep going the way they're going, we don't have a chance on this issue. In the past, our credit card fees averaged about 2.4% of each credit card transaction. That's the total amount of the transaction before I pay my expenses. As a co-owner of the business, I can only take profits out after I pay expenses. We aren't against credit cards and we aren't against reasonable fees. The fact is that many of our customers rely on the convenience of this payment method. The issue is that we have absolutely no control over this cost. It's the cost of the convenience, and it becomes a silent tax to us. What's even worse is how the credit card industry's percentage take has grown. So far this year in 2024, our fees are averaging 3.8%. That jump of nearly 60% is consistent with what we've seen nationally as total Visa and Mastercard credit card fees have gone from $61 billion in 2020 to more than $100 billion in 2023, an increase of more than 60%. Credit card fees now represent our fourth largest business expense after only rent, payroll, and shipping. There have been a lot of big numbers presented so far, and there'll be more. That represents $9,000 to our store, and that's a big number for us. And unlike all our other expenses and vendors, we have no negotiating power to help manage these fees. If I could reduce the amount of swipe fees I pay, it would allow me to hold down prices for my customers, provide additional hours for seasonal staff, improve employee benefits, and put on more local events like our literacy programs and community art projects. Arbitrarily high swipe fees are preventing me from growing my business and better serving my customers while inflating prices we pay for the goods we sell and the prices we charge our customers. That's why I'm here today. It's why I got involved. Our association, the American Booksellers Association, has been an advocate for change, and we've been part of that. Connie and I know how tough it is for us to keep going with these high fees, and we've heard similar stories from our friends and neighbors who have their own small businesses in our town. The bottom line is I need your help. I'm optimistic we can find a better way. I'm here. Please pass the Credit Card Competition Act. Please create a competitive market for credit cards that gives us a chance to grow and succeed. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Callahan. Mr. Sheedy?
Chairman Durbin, Ranking Member Graham, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today about Visa's role in the dynamic and increasingly competitive payments industry. I'm pleased to share with you how Visa fosters security, innovation, and growth that benefits everyone who uses our network, including the consumers and small businesses that are the driving forces of our economy. For over 60 years, Visa has enabled consumers and merchants around the world to make and receive payments through our secure transaction processing network. We are honored that consumers and merchants trust Visa to meet their payment and commerce needs. Although our future success is far from guaranteed, we compete and earn and re-earn the trust of consumers and merchants every day. To do this, Visa remains focused on two fronts: delivering world-class reliability and security, and staying on the cutting edge of innovation. With respect to security, we have never faced greater threats from bad actors, nation-states, and criminals seeking to commit fraud. In the past 5 years, Visa has invested more than $11 billion in technology, including to reduce fraud and enhance cybersecurity. In 2023 alone, Visa blocked $40 billion in suspected fraud globally. If fraud does happen, Visa cardholders benefit from our zero liability protections. They are not responsible for unauthorized transactions. At the same time, merchants who choose to accept Visa are guaranteed payment on transactions authorized on our network. Visa has also helped develop many groundbreaking security features that are now the industry standard for credit card payments, such as chip cards. And our investments in contactless and token technologies are driving the next generation of commerce solutions and experiences. Another important aspect of our network is that it levels the playing field between large and small players. It allows every community bank and credit union, no matter their size, access to the same payment products and network technologies as the largest financial institutions. Similarly, any small-town merchant or online seller can benefit from Visa's world-class security and fraud-fighting tools to better compete with even the largest retailers and their technology platforms. We are proud to offer an open network that makes it easier for every business to compete. As a result, all consumers benefit. We focus on growing transactions on our network, which we can only do when merchants and consumers successfully and securely complete sales. Interchange is a fee between banks that, if properly balanced, encourages parties to use our network. Visa has no incentive to set interchange fees high or low. Without sales, we have no transactions to process. Visa faces unprecedented competition, including from new entrants and technologies from fintech, big tech, and foreign players. Consumers and merchants can choose from an expanding list of alternatives that do not rely on payment networks like Visa to process transactions. These include digital stored value wallets, buy now, pay later platforms, ACH, and a growing number of pay-by-bank solutions. Visa also vigorously competes against cash, check, and other payment card networks and several additional credit and debit options. Government regulation should encourage innovation, security, and consumer choice. The Credit Card Competition Act, however, would remove consumer control over their own payment decisions, reduce competition, impose technology sharing mandates, and pick winners and losers by favoring certain competitors over others. These policies would stifle innovation, create significant inefficiencies, undermine security, and would allow merchants to override a consumer's choice in how they pay. Visa shares the committee's goal in ensuring the payments ecosystem remains competitive. We believe competition benefits everyone. We are proud of the role Visa has played in developing and delivering safe digital payments for consumers and merchants across the United States and the world. I welcome the committee's questions.
Thanks, Mr. Sheedy. Ms. Kirkpatrick.
Good morning, Chairman Durbin, Ranking Member Graham, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to provide background on Mastercard, the competitive environment in which we operate, and the value we bring to consumers and businesses. Mastercard is a global company that connects billions of consumers with businesses and enables them to make payments that are safe and simple. We do this with precision, 200 billion times per year, for nearly $10 trillion of payments annually. Our brand has become synonymous with trust. The payment space in which we operate is massively competitive. There have never been more choices for consumers to pay. These choices range from cash and check to debit, prepaid, credit, buy now, pay later, digital wallets, ACH, real-time payments, account to account, pay by bank, private label, regional networks, cryptocurrencies, and even the Federal Reserve. It's this competition that fuels our motivation to innovate. As noted by the DOJ, Mastercard is a very different company from its largest competitor, both in size and structure. Nearly 40% of our revenues come from services like fraud detection and merchant loyalty. Our customers opt into many of these services because they find value in them. Further, with our credit market share close to Amex, half that of Visa, and less than 5% of all payments, we don't have the share nor the ability to exert market power. The benefits of electronic payments are profoundly impactful. I'd like to draw your attention to 3 such benefits. First, consumers are not responsible for fraud. Second, merchants get paid even when consumers default. Third, consumers and merchants are protected from attacks before they happen. Let's start with consumers not being responsible for fraud. Last year, 52 million Americans had fraud on their accounts. I was one of those individuals, and I would bet many of you were as well. While each situation may have been different, we share one thing in common. We were not responsible for the cost of that fraud. And thank goodness for that, because the cost of fraud was $18 billion last year. Mastercard's zero liability policy protected consumers from these potentially catastrophic losses. Second, merchants get paid even when consumers default. When a consumer uses their card, the merchant gets paid quickly without falling victim to a counterfeit bill, a bounced check, or a debt that won't be paid. The Federal Reserve reports that 4.5% of consumers default. That will be nearly $50 billion this year. Since 2004, this amounted to $685 billion of cost avoidance for merchants. Third, Mastercard protects consumers and merchants from fraud before it happens. Since 2018, we invested $8 billion in cutting-edge technology like biometrics, cyber threat prevention, and other tools to keep them safe. This comes at a significant cost to us, but it produces real results. Just one of our products, SafetyNet, prevented $50 billion of fraud in the past 3 years alone, and the stakes couldn't be higher. Cybercrime is projected to exceed $9 trillion this year. With merchants generating more than $110 trillion in sales and hundreds of billions of dollars in cost avoidance over the past 2 decades, it's clear the value derived from electronic payments far outweighs the cost. This sentiment is often conveyed to us by the small businesses we support. One such merchant is the Nourish Spot, an all-natural food and beverage shop in New York City. Their owner, Dawn Kelly, tells us electronic payments have allowed her to keep making money online even when her store is closed. and she feels safer accepting cards because she knows her payment is guaranteed. All this value is at risk with the bill. It imposes artificial controls on a system that is working well. It'll remove choice from consumers, erode security, and hurt community institutions and credit unions, the very groups we're trying to protect. Why do we know this? Because we've seen it before. Since debit regulation took hold, debit rewards were eliminated, fees went up, access to capital diminished, and competition was stifled. As the DOJ wrote, debit regulation made it even more challenging for Mastercard and other networks to win business. In summary, the payments industry operates efficiently, safely, and cost-effectively. We've never seen more competition or more options for consumers to pay. We're proud of the role Mastercard has played to protect consumers and businesses in the U.S. and around the globe. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you, and I'm happy to answer questions from the committee.
Thanks, Ms. Kirkpatrick. Professor Alford.
Chairman Durbin, Ranking Member Graham, members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify today. I look forward to discussing with you the Credit Card Competition Act. I am here as a neutral expert on behalf of no client and with no financial interest in this legislation. This hearing comes just 2 weeks after a presidential election in which voters expressed extraordinary anxiety about the economy. 41% of voters in the 7 swing states ranked the economy as their top concern, far higher than any other matter. According to exit polls, 32% of voters nationally identified the economy as their most important issue, and of those, 80% voted for President Trump. If you read the party platforms of both parties, it is clear that both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party are competing to be the party of the working class. Leaders in Washington from both political parties want to find appropriate ways to reduce the price of goods and services. The question is how. When we think of consumer spending, credit card swipe fees are not the first thing that comes to mind. Yet those fees are a surprisingly large part of consumer spending. Last year, the average American spent $1,100 in swipe fees, more than they spent on pets, coffee, or alcohol. And I would ask you, which of those 4 are you least excited to be paying for? When we think of my message today is simple. Given the importance of the economy to voters in the last election, this legislation should be judged primarily based on whether it reduces the costs of goods and services for everyday Americans. My written testimony outlines the market failure of credit networks and attempted solutions. Although, as a conservative, I prefer antitrust litigation over regulation, this is a market in which antitrust litigation has never resolved the fundamental problems of Visa and Mastercard's anti-competitive behavior. Pro-competitive regulation in Europe with respect to credit networks and in the United States with respect to debit networks have been more successful and may provide natural experiments of what could be done in the United States. Other witnesses here today will discuss the impact of this legislation on big banks and on retailers. I will highlight just a few key points on the likely impact that they will have on consumers. In the current environment of economic anxiety, everyday Americans are expecting solutions from Washington to address inflation and the high price of goods and services. This legislation should be reviewed from the perspective of that, how it will help consumers with goods and services. The key question is pass-through of potential benefits and pass-through of potential harms. Benefits in the form of lower prices for goods and services, and harms in the form of reduced credit card rewards. Merchants argue that high swipe fees hurt consumers because these costs are passed on in the form of higher prices for goods and services. The narrow profit margins for retailers suggest fierce price competition, increasing the likelihood of pass-through. But at the same time, this is true if swipe fees go down. Independent studies in Europe and in the United States found a 70% pass-through of lower fees for merchants, leading to lower prices for consumers. Visa and Mastercard argue that consumers will suffer from this legislation because banks will reduce credit card reward benefits. That is possible, but it seems unlikely. The net profit margins for banks are approximately 30%, among the highest of any industry in the country. And banks have multiple sources of income, including interchange fees, annual fees, late fees, etc. If Mastercard and Visa are correct that this legislation will harm consumers with reduced credit card rewards, then they should also concede the likelihood that it will benefit consumers with lower prices. Why would banks with high profit margins pass through the harms, but merchants with low profit margins not pass through the benefits? Even assuming pass-through harms and precisely who benefits from credit card reward programs. The Federal Reserve studied that question and found out that, quote, credit card rewards transfer income from less to more educated, from poorer to richer, and from higher to lower minority areas. Using swipe fees to pay rewards programs is a regressive wealth transfer from the many to the few. Consumer benefits and harms are not all alike, and increasing reward programs does not have the same broad distributional benefits as reducing the cost of goods and services. If pass-through happens on both sides, then the trade-off of reducing the price of groceries for every American may be worth fewer benefits to premium cardholders at the airport lounge. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Professor. Mr. Cantor.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to testify today. I appreciate this because what we have and what merchants, including the folks in my association and many others in our coalition, see every day is that there is an ongoing competition policy problem, a real antitrust problem that is squarely within the jurisdiction of this committee that affects them every single day. And that is that Visa and Mastercard have formed the banks that issue credit cards under their names into pricing cartels. They each set the prices that all of their bank members charge. They all agree to charge the same thing, and those banks which compete on everything else don't compete on this. That leads to higher and higher fees and higher costs on Americans every single day. If you take a look at it, both Visa and Mastercard in their testimony very openly say they don't set the interest rates that the banks charge to consumers. They don't set the fees that banks charge to consumers. They don't issue the cards. Yet here they set the price to the merchants. It's the one place where there is no competition across those banks. We need that level of competition because the truth is that we all pay it. So for example, in April of 2022, when both Visa and Mastercard increased their fees, we all paid more than $1.2 billion for that increase. In October of 2023, when they again increased their fees, $500 million more for all Americans. In April of this year, when they both increased fees, another $340 million. And I have with me a notice that Visa, even after just being sued in September by the Department of Justice, has scheduled an increase in their fees for January. That'll be over $100 million that folks will all have to foot the bill for. Now, with these fees going up, and you heard earlier Chris Callahan say 60% increase just since 2020, and his fees are up in 2024. We don't even have those numbers yet. This really hits all of us hard. And it hits the lowest income and lowest credit score folks the worst. Federal Reserve economists put out a study a couple years ago. $13 billion gets transferred from low-income, low credit score individuals to high-income, high credit score individuals through this system. It's an ongoing problem, and consumers don't know it. Everything about this is hidden from them. They're not aware of the role Visa and Mastercard play. They're not aware of the other processors in the system. They're not given information about the pricing or the fact that there's any fees at all. Wouldn't it be interesting and relevant to consumers when they're getting hit with some of the $14 billion they paid in late fees to be able to call their bank and say, hey, wait a minute, I know you got $1,100 in swipe fees from me. You can't cut me a break on this late fee? Of course it would be relevant, but they're not given that information. And so this idea that there's some consumer choice here that's a problem, consumers are not given this information. They don't have the tools to make this decision. and that's on purpose because of the credit card banks. In order for economics and free market economics to work, the folks that actually pay the price and have the information have to make these market decisions. And the Credit Card Competition Act would do that. It's actually very simple. It just says have two networks that work on the card, just like happens on debit cards today in the United States, just like happens in many other parts of the world today, including JP Morgan's recent announcement that they're going to do it voluntarily in France. Great. Then there's actually some price competition between those two networks. The merchant gets to make a choice. And oh, by the way, it's the bank that chooses the two. So everybody's got their choices to be made. The current system simply can't be justified. And frankly, I would even say, with respect to smaller institutions, they are disadvantaged today. The point was made earlier that this helps level the playing field. It doesn't. Smaller institutions don't have the economies of scale that big banks have because they don't issue as many cards, so they have higher costs. By Visa and MasterCard locking in the prices that all those competitors charge, smaller banks are guaranteed a lower margin every time a card is swiped. And you know what? Big banks have taken advantage of that to dominate this market and get most of the market. One last thing I'll quickly say, and there's lots of things to talk about here, but this idea that, oh no, Visa, MasterCard have plenty of competition because there are all these new entrants like mobile payment apps and that sort of thing. According to the San Francisco Fed, those mobile payment apps are less than 1% of payments. I hope someday they will be very robust competitors. They're not today. The evidence of what they're able to get away with shows that there is an antitrust problem, and I appreciate the committee looking at it. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Cantor. Members now have 5 minutes to ask our witnesses questions. I'm going to start. I don't profess to be an expert on anything, except perhaps one thing, airplanes. As a member of Congress, I've spent more time on airplanes than most Americans, and I know a little bit about it. It led me a few years back to conceive of the notion of banning smoking on airplanes. We passed that legislation. Frank Lautenberg was a sponsor in the Senate. But I've come to understand something recently on this issue and airlines that I didn't realize before. It turns out that most of the airlines make more money off the credit card branded credit cards and frequent flyer programs than they do off their air operations. If you look closely at the balance sheet, it turns out that they're not airlines, they're banks that own airplanes. And when it comes down to the profit making, it takes their credit card to lead the way each year, and it means a change in the way we fly on airplanes. Remember those flight attendants? We count on them. What are they there for? Safety, more than anything else. That's what they're there for. They give us a little Diet Coke along the way, but they're there for safety. Did you notice recently that things changed on a lot of airplanes? Once they made their warning announcements and you're buckled in, they start talking to you about their credit card and how you ought to consider buying one of their credit cards, and the flight attendant is going to go up and down the aisle passing out brochures for their new credit card. It really tells the story of what's a priority when it comes to these airlines. And so the question I have in my mind is, why do they sound like shrieking, scalded cats when they hear about consumer competition on credit cards? Why does it scare the living hell out of them? Because they make so much money off them right now. Well, is the converse true? With this regulation and this competition when it comes to interchange fees, change the equation so much that they couldn't be profitable? I use as an illustration the fact that the credit cards are regulated in Europe and the interchange fee is capped at 0.3%. Try to remember that number for a moment. 0.3% interchange fee in Europe for Visa and MasterCard and those who participate in that. What is it in the United States? 1 to 3%. Well, if I can remember basic math, what you're saying is in the United States, the interchange fee is 3 to 10 times as much as it is in Europe. How do they get by with that? How can Visa and MasterCard possibly survive with such a difference, contrast? The bottom line, of course, is that they are profitable in Europe, even when restricted to 0.3% in interchange fees. And it also is very clear that when it comes to these interchange fees and the frequent flyer programs, they're still offering them in Europe. So to me, as I sit here and take a look at the situation, the obvious question I ask Mr. Sheedy is, how can you possibly do business in Europe when the interchange fee is restricted at a maximum of 0.3%?
Thank you, Senator Durbin. You're correct. The European government did regulate interchange rates in Europe. The government in Europe imposed a fixed interchange fee, and it did impact the market. While you're correct that there are some reward programs in Europe, the majority of them were either eliminated or greatly devalued. Consumer rewards, which are enjoyed by 84% of U.S. cardholders today. So it's a broad spectrum, broad socioeconomic spectrum of U.S. consumers enjoy rewards. That is not the case in Europe, where reward programs have been reduced, fees to consumers have gone up. You're correct, the market adjusted, but ultimately we think that those changes that happened in Europe were bad for European consumers and European cardholders.
Let me ask you a question about an individual. Show the chart. Are you familiar with Mr. Prabhu, Mr. Sheedy?
Yes, he used to be the chief financial officer of Visa.
He said, net, we are a beneficiary of inflation. Visa was a beneficiary. How is that possible?
I don't think of Visa as being a beneficiary of of inflation, excuse me. It's impossible for me to know the context within which Vasant
So let me read
a statement.
a larger part of the quote. To the extent that there's inflation driving up ticket size, clearly it's beneficial to us, he said, on behalf of Visa. So net, I mean we are a beneficiary of inflation. So while American families are struggling to survive against inflation, you're doing quite well, as long as the ticket size goes up and your percentage applies, correct?
I don't believe that inflation is good for our business or anyone's business. I think a healthy economy is best for the U.S. consumer, U.S. merchants, and when U.S. merchants and U.S. consumers come together and transact, that drives transactions on our network. That's what we want, and that's how we think about growing the business.
Well, I can tell you that the CFO of your company, January 27th, 2022, had a different point of view and one that makes more sense. You're in a situation where you're benefiting from the weakness in our economy and the fact that its impact on Mr. Callahan as well as families and consumers. What we're trying to do here is to do something you said you favor. Competition benefits everyone. Why not some competition for Visa and Mastercard? Senator Graham.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's been a very informative hearing, and I will ask simple questions because that's all I know how to do here. So, simple question. The rates in Europe are by regulation, is that right, Mr. Sheedy?
Yes, Senator.
The argument is that rates are high here because we have a monopoly, no competition. Is that right, Mr. Cantor?
That's right.
Okay. So you agree with me, Europe doesn't use competition to get rates down, they use regulation. Are you proposing we use regulation or competition?
We're proposing competition. That's what's in the bill.
And there's no data about what competition does yet, right?
Actually, there is, because in many places around the world, they do have that competition
Like
on
where?
credit cards.
Like
so France, Denmark, South Korea, also several of the debit systems, including in the
talking
U.S.
about
and
credit
Canada,
cards.
have competition as well.
For credit cards?
So that's on debit, but in Europe and Korea,
so
it's on
here's
credit.
my point. We got two systems here. We got a regulatory system that reduces cost to consumers, and Mr. Alford, you say in Europe it actually does benefit the consumer. Their lower exchange fees.
The lower exchange fees do benefit consumers with respect to the price of goods and services because 70%.
Okay. The question is, if you lowered their costs, would it matter to you, the consumer? At least in Europe, the answer is yes.
Can you repeat the question?
At least in Europe, the answer is yes. The regulation has lowered cost to consumers.
Yes, the regulation in Europe has.
And in theory, competition would lower cost here.
Yes, I mean,
Do you prefer competition or regulation of the fees?
I prefer competition, and I think that
Does anybody prefer regulation? Okay.
Well, regulation can be pro-competitive, of course.
Yeah, but I mean, we don't have any.
The proposal is to not have a price caps
The proposal is to create competition.
through routing restrictions.
So
exactly.
Senator Durbin's not proposing regulation, he's proposing competition, is that correct?
Yes, introducing.
And in Europe, they don't have a competition, they have regulation. Yes. And we know in Europe, the swipe fees are cheaper, right? And you tell us, Mr. Alford, in Europe, the consumer benefits.
Independent studies have revealed that there is significant pass-through, yes.
Okay. And you say, Mr. Shih, that consumers in Europe get less rewards, is that correct?
Their fees are higher and they get fewer rewards.
Are their fees higher than yours?
I'm referring, Senator, to the fees that are being charged by the banks.
Oh, wait a minute. No. The swipe fees in Europe are regulated at what? 0.3.
Correct.
Okay, and what are your swipe fees?
The average interchange fee in the United States on credit is approximately 2%.
Okay, again, this is simple. 2% is bigger than 0.3, I think, right?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. So here we are. What I'm trying to figure out is, should I do a regulatory approach? Because nobody really can tell me what competition is going to do. I know what regulation is done over there. Now what I want to do is figure out, what do you lose if you regulate? So, Ms. Kirkpatrick, what kind of reward programs are offered? You get reward. What kind of stuff do you get? The reward programs.
Senator, there's a variety of reward
name
programs which range from cash back to rewards for travel to rewards for everyday purchases like gas and grocery.
Okay, so lower income people can participate in this reward program.
Yes, greater than 80% of cardholders in the United States can benefit from these rewards.
So, Mr. Cantor, you say that most low-income people kind of don't, they get left out here, right?
They pay more in the fees, and much more of the rewards go to the high-income folks. That's according to the Federal Reserve.
Okay. Do you agree with that, Ms. Kirkpatrick?
I agree that 80% or more of cardholders
No,
in
that's
the
not
U.S.
the question. Do you agree with what the Federal Reserve said?
I agree with the fact that rewards are widely available.
No, it's a simple question. Do you agree with what the Federal Reserve analysis was?
I haven't seen that particular
Well, you need to look
analysis.
at it. So here's my deal. I'm very open-minded to solution. I generally like competition, except when they're monopolies. The whole idea of regulation is to make sure that in a capitalist society, water is in the bank. It doesn't overflow. I don't know exactly how I'm going to come out, but you're having a hard time convincing me that the fees here are set to the advantage of the consumer. Thanks.
Thanks, Senator Graham. Senator Coons.
Thank you, Chairman Durbin and Ranking Member Graham, for convening this hearing today. It concerns a fairly technical set of issues that most people don't really have visibility into how it impacts them. They just swipe or tap or purchase and move on. And I'm thrilled that we've got representatives here, both from the card networks and from a small business owner and an organization of small businesses and a professor who's just commenting as an independent, so that we have a chance to hear from both sides of this. As a senator, I've heard a lot from both sides of this. My dry cleaner, small business owner, every single time I drop off my dry cleaning says, can't you do more about these swipe fees? And yet the building next door to him is full of people whose business is preventing fraud and working for credit card issuing banks, large and small. It's no mystery I'm from a state that issues a whole lot of credit cards. But I have heard a lot from my constituents, from restaurateurs to small business owners to dry cleaners to a bookstore owner, concerned about these fees and what the impact is. So I'd like to just get into one core assertion that was made,
that, as Mr. Sheedy said, there is competition, a significant amount of competition. And I think Ms. Kirkpatrick said the payment space is massively competitive, and that fuels innovation. You have no market power because you control only 5% of payments. And yet others have asserted that there's a monopoly here, massive market power, and that that's driving fees that do not actually benefit consumers or merchants. Do I get that essentially right? Could each of you speak to that briefly? When you say that this is a massively competitive market, I don't know enough about it, but there's a lot of fintech solutions. There are still people using cash, I'm told. Apparently fewer and fewer of them. But there's folks using Venmo and Cash App and lots of other applications that may or may not have a credit card attached to them. What's the benefit? Is this massively competitive? If we followed the approach that this bill follows, what would the impact be to consumers? And my other question, we have tried this before, but in a different way. The Durbin Amendment imposed a cap on debit card swipe fees. Has that intervention in the market benefited merchants, benefited consumers? What's the record? We've got 2.5 minutes. So frankly, is it massively competitive, and what were the benefits to consumers of the previous act? If I could just ask the 5 witnesses to go down in order at a Ms. Kirkpatrick leaped to the mic because you were the one who said it's massively competitive. So with the forbearance of if you'd start, Ms. Kirkpatrick, and then the other witnesses. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Appreciate the questions. With respect to massive competition in the marketplace, there are multiple stakeholders who have entered the market, as I mentioned in my testimony, like PayPal Venmo, who have created an ecosystem of value exchange and consumers sending money to each other that sits completely outside the credit card rails. And that is massively successful. In fact, likely many of us leverage that ecosystem. And so when we think about payments, payments is much broader than cards. Payments considers all of those other rails. And the reality is that we do have not only competition, but importantly, consumer choice. Consumers have a plethora of choices in how they want to both pay and be paid. And they've never been presented with more choices.
Mr. Cantor, you've asserted that customers actually don't know what these choices are, and they're sort of stumbling their way towards alternatives like Venmo or Cash App. Help me with that.
So look, there is competition on the consumer side of the market. That's not what we're arguing here. Consumers can choose many different things. It's on the merchant side where Visa and MasterCard set the prices where there's not competition. And frankly, look, it is very difficult to hear both Visa and MasterCard today testify that there's competition on the merchant side of the market when literally just 2 months ago, the Department of Justice filed a complaint against Visa, and major allegations in the complaint were that Visa pays off Apple, PayPal, and Square, which owns the Cash App, not to compete with them. How in the world can they maintain at a hearing today that there's competition when they're literally paying off the competition not to compete with them?
Mr. Cantor, Mr. Sheedy, did you want to respond to that?
I'm happy to respond to the last point. We do have a commercial agreement with Apple. It doesn't have them to not compete with us. We have an agreement where we share very sophisticated security technology that enables Apple Pay to work. We have a commercial agreement that sort of governs that arrangement with Apple, but there's nothing in that arrangement that impacts their ability to compete with us. In fact, they're free to compete with us, and we, in our view, they do.
Mr. Callahan, you get the closing word. As a small business owner, what are the costs and challenges to you of accepting things other than credit cards, and what are the costs of accepting credit cards?
Sure. Thank you very much. Some of the challenges are rather legal and pragmatic. We operate in New York State. We are not allowed to charge a surcharge to pass that along to consumers. We eat it as a business. So that's one thing. The other part of what we do as a business is, in business, you can compete on price, you can compete on quality, you can compete on service. We're unlikely to ever compete on price. And so passing along these fees to consumers is going to make that even more difficult. We compete on quality and customer service as a small independent bookstore, and that's where we'd rather put our efforts. I don't have a real sense of how competitive this is. What I can tell you is the impact is that the bulk of the fees that I get on 4 pages of credit card swipe processing statement every month, the bulk of it is coming from Visa and Mastercard. It's not the intermediate handlers and merchant services.
Thank you all very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Coons. Senator Grassley.
Yeah. First of all, I want to put a couple letters from Iowans in the record on this issue.
These are real Iowans?
Yeah, it's real Iowans.
Let's put them in the record.
Sure enough, thank you. I'm leading into Mr. Shee question. Last time the Judiciary Committee held a hearing on credit card competition, many of you testified before this committee, and I asked your thoughts about the credit card duopoly claims. Now the Justice Department has brought a case regarding antitrust concerns to the debit card market. Despite the passage of the Durbin Amendment, the department judge alleges that Visa has an unlawful monopoly. So further, what you just recently discussed, Mr. Sheedy, how is the credit card market different than the debit card market? Pardon me for coughing.
The credit card market in the United States is very different, Senator. First, American Express, who does not operate as a four-party system, would be outside of the scope of this legislation, is a huge player in the U.S. credit card market. Very successful and has defined historically a very high rewards, high feature customer service, and that's something that financial institutions who issue credit cards in the United States have had to respond to. The credit card market in the United States has 4,000 financial institutions underneath the Visa system, credit unions, community banks, as well as larger financial institutions who issue credit cards. When you look at other markets around the world, they are not nearly as diverse. They're much more concentrated in fewer players. And so I think drawing analogies between what happened outside the United States with interchange regulation and how consumers in the United States would be impacted by this legislation, I think is concerning to us. We do believe that the consumer, when they try to pay with their Visa card, they have expectations about how that transaction is going to be processed and the features and the benefits that they're going to enjoy. And we feel that those benefits and that choice should remain from the consumer. This legislation would hand that to the merchant.
Okay, Mr. Cantor, the original Durbin Amendment sought to promote competition among debit card networks. Has it worked?
It has. Now, there are some problems with it because, as the Department of Justice has alleged, Visa has tried to evade that law and caused antitrust violations in the process. But it has worked. Fees have been lower. Several studies, including the ones cited by the credit card industry to say consumers haven't benefited, show that consumers have benefited. Happy to have everybody read the studies that they cite as well as the ones we do. The one they cite from the University of Pennsylvania Law Review shows 53% direct pass-through immediately to consumers and lower price. The one we cite, and Roger Alford cited to a study, 70% pass-through. And frankly, the rest is taken up in paying employees more and competing on service and the things that Chris Callahan just talked about. Profit margins for retailers did not go up one iota. In fact, in grocery, they went down. So it's been much better for consumers. And I think this whole discussion of rewards, having a few of the numbers is really key here. And let's just understand, on credit cards, Senator Marshall went through some of this, but from consumers, the banks that issue credit cards get $125 billion a year in interest and fees, $125 billion. From merchants, they get $172 billion a year in swipe fees. Only $41 billion gets paid in rewards each year on $300 billion in revenue. This idea that rewards will go away if you reduce those fees by what's estimated for the Credit Card Competition Act is $16 billion. So now we're at $284 billion combined dollars to pay $41 billion in rewards. If the banking industry, which has the highest profit margins of any industry in the United States, bar none, can't make that work, I don't know what we can do for them.
Yeah. My time's about up, so I got a question. It's going to take 5 minutes to get an answer, so I'm going to submit it for answer in writing, but I'd appreciate if it was for all of you to respond to.
Thank you, Senator Grassley. Senator Klobuchar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Grassley, direct as usual. Thank you. I'll start out with you, Mr. Cantor. Last time we discussed this topic in the committee, you agreed we needed more antitrust enforcement in the area. It is actually fitting that Senator Grassley and I are both here because he and I worked very hard for years and years to pass our bill to change the merger fees to charge less on small mergers, more on big ones. We finally passed that through the Senate. I think we're finally seeing the fruition of some of this to our agencies. However, we want to make sure that we keep the pressure on as a new administration starts, that this has been a bipartisan effort beyond the topic of this hearing. Since then, we've seen the Justice Department suing Visa for the monopolization of debit card network services. The FTC entered a consent decree with Mastercard, not to mention a pending settlement in a private antitrust lawsuit. How has the increased enforcement benefited merchants and consumers? What areas do you believe that enforcers, as we go into a new administration, need to focus on?
Thank you, Senator. And first of all, thank you for your thought leadership on these antitrust issues. It's incredibly helpful across a range of things. Enforcement has helped. Certainly the FTC's action with Mastercard has been helpful, and it's not the first time they've had to weigh in on this. There were issues with Visa and Mastercard and the point-of-sale providers getting in the way of competition on debit cards as well. We very much welcome the Department of Justice suit against Visa. Obviously, that has to play out. We'll see where that goes. But I think what's telling here is that the DOJ lawsuit is only on debit cards, even though Wall Street Journal story just after that came out shows much of similar behavior applies to credit cards as well. The problem is, on credit cards, there's no underlying competitive dynamic or law that creates some competitive market economics here. We need that. That's why we need this bill, is so that the enforcers can do their job like they're doing on debit cards.
Thank you very much. Professor Alford, when you served in the Justice Department's Antitrust Division, the Supreme Court created new rules in the Ohio v. American Express case, dictating how antitrust enforcers must evaluate two-sided markets. If you could quickly answer, because I have one other question, how has this decision affected the ability of antitrust enforcers to deter anti-competitive conduct in two-sided platform markets?
Yeah, two-sided platform markets. Thank you for your question. Two-sided platform markets are basically where there's a simultaneous transaction that happens in which the fee happens and it affects both the merchant and the buyer at the same time. As a result of that decision, now there's been incredible difficulty about market definitions, and it's much more difficult now to determine what the market definitions are for antitrust cases. And therefore, that's been a difficult issue with respect to how to enforce anti-competitive conduct with respect to these credit card companies.
Okay, thank you. I'll follow up in writing. I recently introduced a bill, the Preventing Algorithmic Collusion Act, to ensure that middlemen do not use algorithms to circumvent our price-fixing laws to raise prices, such as coordinating rent hikes among landlords. While credit card networks do not collect interchange fees, they do set the interchange fee charge by issuing banks to most merchants. Mr. Sheedy, can you elaborate on how the fees are determined and the considerations involved in the process? And do you use algorithms that process data derived from issuing banks?
The first question, the factors that we bring into interchange is really all facets of the business. We start with understanding the competitive environment. We would like for the card to be accepted as broadly as it can be accepted. The merchant point of view is very important and a huge part of how Visa has positioned itself historically as being accepted in more locations. It's a big part of how we think about interchange fees in terms of encouraging the adoption of new technology. So we create incentives in the fee structure. We consider them incentives. Some people might consider them penalties. But if you can adopt a new technology that reduces risk and takes fraud out of the system and improves streamlined processing, then you would qualify for lower interchange rates. And that's a big part of the structure. We do spend quite a bit of time understanding the needs of the 4,000 credit card issuers across the United States, all of our clients, the costs that they incur in supporting consumers. And it's very expensive to issue a product and to provide payment guarantee and online customer service, zero liability. All of those things and many more, Senator, get factored into interchange. I don't want to go on too far there because I want to get to the second part of your question, which is
algorithms.
We've invested significantly in the sophistication of our algorithms, AI included, and they are squarely and wholly focused on reducing fraud and addressing cyber risk in the system, which we've done very effectively. As I sit here, I can't think of anything that we do along the lines of what you're discussing that's outside of the area of driving network security and improving cyber risk. In a very difficult time.
Okay, well, I'll follow up in writing because my colleagues have questions. But my concern is that in at least the work I've done in the rent area, that literally these are being used for a high-price, sophisticated price-fixing scheme because all these people are throwing their data in, and then another entity is figuring out what the price should be. And so they're actually coordinating all the information that's out there. So, thank you.
Thanks, Senator Klobuchar. Senator Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Sheedy, you are senior advisor to the Visa CEO?
Yes, sir.
The Visa CEO was too busy to come today?
He had a conflict, Senator. He knows that I enjoyed speaking with this committee 2 years ago and that I was looking forward to coming back, but he unfortunately was not able to be here today.
What was his conflict?
I honestly don't know what his conflict was, but I know he was unable to be here today.
But it was more important that he be somewhere else than here.
He was unable to be here today. He sends his regards.
Send them right back to him.
All right.
Look, I don't, if we had to vote on this bill today, I don't know how I would vote. But I want to thank the chairman for calling this hearing. I've learned a lot today. I've just got a couple of questions and then an observation. Professor, you seem to be fairly objective here. Congress capped the fees on debit cards. Is that correct?
That's correct, for certain transactions, yes.
The savings, has it been passed on to the consumer and or invested in the retailer's business?
Yes, so the average rate for...
Give me, I don't speak
Yes.
Sanskrit.
Yes,
Okay?
the answer is yes.
I need short answers.
Yes.
Is that a yes or a no?
Yes.
Okay. And we addressed the issue in debit cards by regulating. We capped the fees. This bill doesn't cap fees like they do in Europe, as Senator Graham so eloquently pointed out. This bill just introduces competition.
That's correct.
Okay. All right, I really came today to watch Senator Hawley and to learn. But here's my observation. I'm going to cede my time to Senator Hawley. Let me just say this to all of you, but particularly our friends at Visa and Mastercard, and I mean it. I don't know how I would vote if this bill came up today. Visa and Mastercard and the folks, the retailers, need to sit down and work this out. You need to sit down and work this out. Because if you don't, Congress is going to do something. I'm not sure what we're going to do. But Visa and Mastercard, when we get through with you, you could end up looking like either the post office or the Dallas Cowboys. I'm not sure we'll get it right. And I'm not a big fan of the European model. That we're seeing the cost right now in Europe of their penchant for regulation. But what I do care is the fact that the high prices in this country are gutting the American people like a fish. And we're trying to address it. And my strong advice to you is to sit down and try to work this out and come up with a solution that's fair for the consumer, fair for the retailer, but also respects Visa and Mastercard. You're two great companies, and I appreciate that. But something's not adding up here. And next time, Mr. Sheedy, it's wonderful to see you. Ask your CEO to come. I know he's a busy, important man, but ask him to come.
Thank you, Senator Kennedy. Senator Rono.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't think it is the easiest thing to figure out how competition even enters the marketplace in terms of these kinds of fees. And I would think that the larger retailers, maybe somebody can answer this question, are larger retailers able to negotiate with MasterCard and Visa on the fees charged?
So I will tell you, Senator, that only a tiny number in special circumstances can, short of suing them and settling a lawsuit. But for example, Costco, because they're a club a retailer where people pay them in advance for the privilege of shopping there, they can do different things than most. But even the largest have this same problem.
So that means that the millions of small retailers who are in the marketplace, that they pretty much have to take whatever is charged to them, and then any pass on to the consumers. I think that doesn't even happen, even among the large retailers who can negotiate these fees. Now, there's been discussion about the earlier Durbin bill that set fees. Caps on debit card fees. Why don't we just talk about setting caps on other charge cards?
Frankly,
I mean, I'm not, and also, I'm not saying that that ultimately either way the consumers benefit. By the way, I think that what we're talking about is how retailers, where competition can enter even in the retailer space. So why aren't we talking about setting caps on regular charge cards and not just debit cards?
So the feedback we've heard from members of Congress is that they like taking this competitive approach first. We think it's the lightest regulatory touch to help deal with this problem. Obviously, there's lots of our members who would love for there to be caps like there are in Europe, but as a practical matter, we think this is the best approach at this time to make some progress. We trust the market to work out if we have that actual competition. If the cards are as valuable as Visa and MasterCard say, the price could go up. But we have faith that the market economics will work here.
Well, there are a lot of markets where competition doesn't exactly work. Would you agree?
There are, when there are market failures, like in this one today, absolutely.
So, and even if we were to do this, then are consumers benefited ultimately? They only benefit if the lower fees are somehow resulting in lower product prices. And there's absolutely nothing in this bill that would require any kind of pass-through.
We've seen the experience where with 3% profit margins at retail that did not go up post-Durbin Amendment, there was not any more profit taken at all, that 70% of those savings went directly to consumers. As I said, even the study that the credit card industry cites to say consumers didn't benefit, on the numbers says 53% of the savings went directly to consumers. So there's no doubt consumers are saving. There's just a question of how much.
There's another study from the Richmond Fed that showed that that more than 15 times as many merchants increased prices after the debit caps went into place than lowered their prices. So I think the research on this is not clear, that putting in caps on interchange benefits merchants, benefits consumers. It definitely benefits merchants, and in some instances, they've not only have not passed on the benefit, but they've increased prices. I do think that there is a concern here about the impact on consumers.
Yeah, and I would say that the discussion leads me to conclude that benefit to consumers is not what the results will be, but there is definitely benefit to retailers who will then either have a cap applied or in this case creating some options. And I'm just not sure that there's that much clarity as to how we're going about things. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Rono. Senator Blackburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all. What an interesting hearing. And I appreciate that you all would take the time to be here. Mr. Callahan, I want to come to you first. I have so many small businesses in Tennessee that I talk with. And, you know, I kind of have this vantage point of having worked with them earlier in my career, watching the movement from in-store credit, chasing bad checks, going through factoring, all of that, which was an enormous expense. And then watching what is happening now when people can simply tap a card. I've also found it very interesting that some of these small businesses choose to limit it to only using a Visa or Mastercard. And so they're predetermining the choice for the consumer. So do you limit the swipes to Visa and Mastercard, or do you take all cards?
We take all cards.
You take all cards, okay. And then you're a fairly new small business, right?
We've owned it 15 years. It
15
existed
years.
for 40
Okay.
years.
And before that, the people that owned it before you did you talk to them about their compliance cost and how much they spent chasing bad debt?
We did not.
You did not. You know, I think that might be an insightful conversation because so many of the small businesses I've talked to have talked about how it really is good not to have to take a lot of the bad debt and the returns and those transactions that booted your compliance cost and your loss cost, just kept booting it up so high. I would think that's especially relevant in times like we're in right now. I was appreciative that the chairman mentioned high inflation. I think the American people spoke loud and clear on that. They're tired of this high inflation. But I don't think that that's the underlying cause for the swipe fee issue, Mr. Chairman. I do think that many of the Biden-Harris economic policies have driven that high inflation cost, and it doesn't rest solely on swipe fees. But let's see, Ms. Kirkpatrick, I want to come to you. When you are looking at the cost to consumers and you're looking at what this would do if you're going to demand competition, I want you to give me just one or two harms that would come to American consumers through the CCCA.
Thank you, Senator. What this proposed legislation will do is take choice away from consumers and put it in the hands of just a few large companies. Today, a consumer can walk into a merchant and leverage their credit product. They know which brand they're using, they know which rewards they'll avail themselves of, and they know, most importantly, that it's
So
safe.
it disrupts their process.
So the consumer will lose their choice.
Yes.
And the choice will be left up to just a few players.
Okay. Mr. Alford, I want to come to you for a quick question as we talk about this issue, because, see, I believe this is one of those issues that, and I've got friends in the banking business, I've got friends that are small business owners, and so there's differences of opinions there. And Senator Graham got to this a little bit in talking about the difference between regulation and mandates and competition. And I have always told everybody this is going to be a decision, a business process decision that you ought to be able to negotiate. But I want you to talk for a minute. Let's see if you've looked at what happens as you look at credit cards, but also Apple Pay systems, Venmo, PayPal. I know many companies are looking at the Bitcoin blockchain system to simplify processing, payment processing. Have you considered that into what you're looking at as an antitrust issue? Have you considered that impact, and what do you expect that impact to be?
Yeah, thank you. So I agree that you should generally try to trust the markets, and only in situations of market failure
It's
should we
usually a good long-term decision.
Exactly. So if antitrust litigation could solve this problem, I think I would favor that, but I don't think it can. So the answer to your question is that credit card transactions have not gone down as a result of these new innovations. It's actually, they're just saying, I think it's 33% of all transactions are done through credit cards.
Consumer choice.
Consumer choice. And
Consumer
those
choice is a
innovations
good
are
thing.
welcome, and I think we should applaud those. But we have problems on their end as well. DOJ is not only suing Visa for monopoly practices, they're also suing Apple for their monopoly practices with respect to their Apple Wallet. And Apple Wallet restrictions are significant. You cannot use your Bank of America or Chase app on your phone to basically pay for something. You have to use Apple Wallet because of restrictions that Apple has imposed on the use of smartphone transactions.
Okay.
Senator Welch.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. You know, the concern that I think all of us have to have is the erosion of small businesses in our small communities. They are so essential to the well-being of where we live and how we live. And you're here representing a small business. The issue here is about the powerlessness of businesses. And there's a difference between the bookstore and Visa and Mastercard, by the way, and their capacity to have any control over what their costs are when the well-being and their capacity to survive is beneficial to the citizens in all of our communities. And they're getting hammered constantly. You know, I want to talk to Mr. Sheehy and Ms. Kirkpatrick. You talked about the virtues and the benefits of what is provided. I totally agree. It's good to have security. It's good to have fraud protection. It's good to have merchant confidence that the payment will be honored. That is good. It doesn't justify the rip-off prices. And it's painful for me to have you sitting next to Mr. Callahan. You know, your CEO, what's he make? $23 million in 2023, is that what it was? Your CEO, $24 million?
The information is public. I don't have it at my
That's right. Market cap for Visa, $600 billion, $611 billion. Market cap for Mastercard is $478 billion.
Yes.
All right, so let's go to this question. You're concerned, you said this, Mr. Sheehy, that if there was a lower price, there wouldn't be confidence necessarily that the consumer would benefit. Correct?
I expressed some concern, Senator, with the price caps that were
All right, so
implemented.
let's just talk what that really means. You want to have the right to do the rip-off rather than let him get the discount. That's what you're arguing. Who will get the benefit? We don't know necessarily. But if you have 4 gas stations on the corner and one of those goes out there and reduces price by 2 cents, you know what? I think competition then is going to put the pressure on the others. I want to talk about another thing. The rates that you charge merchants vary. What do you charge Walmart?
We have a large business with Walmart.
What do you charge Walmart? Level it. Let's be candid and transparent instead of rhetorical. What do you charge Walmart?
Senator, as I sit here, I don't know what the Walmart rate.
What do you charge Mr. Callahan? Ms. Kirkpatrick, what do you charge Walmart?
I don't have the information. It's
What do you charge Mr. Callahan?
I would have to look.
Well, you both negotiate with Walmart, right? Because they're big.
Walmart's a big customer.
If Mr. Callahan wants to get the Walmart deal, does he have your phone number or know how to get it and call you up and say, hey, let's make a deal? We're having tough times here in Cambridge and I want to keep selling books to my community. Can he call you? Can he call you?
I would welcome the opportunity to talk to Mr. Callahan and connect him to third parties that can help
How
him
many millions
exercise his
of
rights.
Mr. Callahans do you have?
There are 33 million U.S. businesses.
So do you have a business unit where you have lots of people who can handle 33 million accounts like Mr. Callahan's who call you up? You know, you talked about how you know the customer. What about the merchant? They're getting so ripped off, so ripped off. Now, where's that chart here? You know, this is another issue. 0.3% in-person cap in the EU, right? Visa does business, right, in the EU?
Yes.
And Mastercard does business in the EU, right?
Yes.
And all of those wonderful things you described, fraud protection, consumer confidence, you do that in Europe just like you do here in the United States, right?
Yes.
So why not have Mr. Callahan pay the lower rate and all of Mr. Callahans around the country? What's the problem? You're able to do it and make a profit.
Senator, we share your values in wanting to drive lower prices for small businesses.
You are killing small business in the United States of America. I yield back.
Senator Tillis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I sometimes think the Durbin-Marshall bill is a lot like a zombie in a Walking Dead episode. Just when you think you've killed it, it comes out of the closet and comes again. Look, I believe that we've got to fix a problem. Before I ask a couple of questions, I want to go back to what Senator Kennedy said. He and I were talking before the hearing. You all know that I have said that we've got to come up with a solution. Now, we have a court case where a judge decided that the settlement wasn't enough and that it should be adjudicated, which seems interesting to me. The other thing I find interesting is I don't see a single credit union or a bank at the dais, because I suspect they would give you a different perspective. I think it would be helpful to actually even have a bank or a card issuer in some of the foreign jurisdictions that we're talking about being best practices to see if they share your optimism about the outcome. We have a problem here. Durbin-Marshall is not the solution. It will create more problems, and I'm very sensitive to small businesses. I have said to many people, some of them are in this room today, that you've got a Congress and a half to solve this problem, in my estimation. I don't have a whole lot of skills here, but counting votes and observing trends is one of them. This Durbin-Marshall bill is not going to pass in this Congress. I think anybody realistic knows that. We've only got 1.5 Scaramucci's of legislative days before we're out of Congress. So it's not going to happen. This is a good hearing. We're exchanging information. What I hope that we do here is recognize that small businesses have a legitimate concern. I will also say that every single one of those small businesses could take their swipe machine and throw it in the trash if they didn't think that they weren't getting added value for it. Fair statement? So why don't we actually work on something that's not disruptive and doesn't repeat the mistakes of other countries who have made mistakes? They have seen measurable negative impacts as a result of the overreach. This is not that hard, folks. Now, I will say to the industry, if you don't figure that out and make sure that small businesses aren't coming to this hearing and say, we've got something that's sustainable and acceptable, then you're going to get Durbin-Marshall in about, I don't know, I would estimate 1.5 to 2.5 years, if not the next Congress, the Congress after. But I, for one, think that the credit card issuer, if I'm not mistaken, Visa MasterCard gets about 10% of the exchange fees, about 80, 90% ultimately goes to the bank and other players in the exchange. Is that roughly correct?
Senator, the interchange fees we're referring to here today go 100% to the banks.
Okay. Now, I got a real quick question for you. If I were to search for a breakdown, this is a yes-no, and I mean literally yes-no question for Visa and MasterCard. If I were to search for a breakdown of processing and interchange fees for your companies, Visa, MasterCard, would I be able to find that information online?
Yes.
Yes, multiple sources.
Do all of your competitors also post this information? All but one, notably Discovery. I don't know where they're headquartered. While I understand the difference between 3- and 4-party payment models, does CCCA cover both types of payment systems?
No.
Oh, interesting. So not all of the companies, let me put it a different way. Not all competitors would not be covered. Double negative.
I believe the answer is yes.
Yeah, okay. Correct. So to summarize, as Visa and MasterCard, your current competitors, one, do not publicly post their interchange fees, right? You all do. They don't. Why wouldn't they not be subject to the same policy we're talking about here? Why would we find a way to take an Amex and Discover and put them in whatever regiment? I mean, would you agree that if we're going to come out with something like this, that there is a valid argument to say that everybody needs to be invited to the party?
Given that our market share is largely in line with American Express's, I would agree with that.
Okay, close to a yes.
Senator.
We have other concerns with the legislation, Senator, but I agree with your point.
All right. Look, I'm going to, Mr. Chair, I'd seek unanimous consent that I put a number of articles into the record that discuss the experiences in other jurisdictions that have made the mistake of going in the direction of Durbin-Marshall. I'd like unanimous consent to submit to the record.
The Zombie Caucus gives unanimous consent.
Thank you, sir. Folks, it's serious. All seriousness, I want small business owners over the next 24 months to come in here and say, we'd always like more, but we got a fair deal. If that happens, then this goes away, the zombie stays in the closet. If it doesn't, you're going to lose. And frankly, I hate to say this, but I don't really care. Visa and MasterCard have to figure out how to be successful businesses. I'm trying to come up with an outcome that solves the problem of the consumers and solves the problem of small businesses. And I believe that you all want to do the same. Get in a room and solve it, because I'll guarantee you the solution coming from Congress will not be good for anyone. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Hawley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just on that point about Visa and MasterCard being successful businesses, I think you figured it out, haven't you? I mean, what's your profit margin, Ms. Kirkpatrick?
It's circa 50%.
Mr. Sheedy?
Slightly higher.
It's higher than 50% profit margin?
Slightly higher than MasterCard, yes.
Yeah, that's incredible. 50% profit margin. I mean, that's absolutely unbelievable. What's the answer to the Walmart question, by the way, that Senator Welch posed to you? What's Walmart's interchange fee that you negotiate with them?
I don't have it with me today.
You don't have any idea whatsoever? Is it higher or lower than 2.5%?
Walmart negotiates their rates based on the business that they do with us.
Meaning they're big, they're really big, they're gigantic, so they get a better deal than Mr. Callahan or most small businesses in Missouri. Is that what you're telling me?
Yeah, Senator, we have volume discounts that we offer to some merchants. I suspect Walmart is one of them. And I don't believe that it's commercially unreasonable to get an arrangement where, in exchange for more volume, a merchant can qualify for lower rates?
Well, I'm sure it's not commercially unreasonable for Walmart, or certainly it's in their financial interest and in yours, but I doubt it's in Mr. Callahan's financial interest. And my question to you, Mr. Callahan, is when you've got Walmart and other major competitors getting charged much less than you are, why in the world would you stick with these guys? I mean, why is it that small businesses continue to use Visa and MasterCard when you're getting charged so much more?
It's in my opinion, it's a matter of convenience for the customer, and customers matter to our business.
Maybe is it because that Visa and MasterCard are effectively monopolies? They control 80% of the market?
Certainly part of the
80% of the market? I'm just having a hard time understanding, Mr. Sheedy and Ms. Kirkpatrick, you have a business model. You're making over 50% profit margin. You are able to give the shaft to small businesses. Estimated cost to Missouri businesses from these fees is $1.5 billion. That's with a B, $billion a year. Why aren't all of these businesses running away from this model? Because they don't have a choice, because you control so much of the market. This is classic monopolistic behavior, and yet your testimony here today is you don't want any competition. You have 80% of the market, but you don't want any more competition. I'm having a hard time finding that position defensible, let alone sympathetic. I mean, it's unbelievable the amount of money that you're making. It's unbelievable what you're charging small businesses and consumers, and yet your testimony is, please, we can't possibly have any competition. I mean, let's talk about what you're doing to consumers who hold your cards. Last year, as I understand it, there were 726 million Visa and MasterCard credit cards issued in the United States. That's about 2 for every 1 person in the United States of America. Do either of you know how much debt is owed on your networks, Ms. Kirkpatrick?
We're not the bank, so we don't have visibility into that information. We also don't generate revenue from interchange.
Oh, okay, you have no idea. Mr. Sheedy, do you know?
I don't know.
Well, let me help you out. Let's have a look. It's $1.17 trillion. $1.17 trillion is what consumers now owe on your credit card networks. Do either of you know what the average interest rate is on your networks? Ms. Kirkpatrick?
Oh, Senator, we're not the bank. We don't set the interchange.
I know,
we don't
but
set
you
the
benefit
rates.
from it, and you know. Do you know what it is? This is your business model.
We don't collect revenue from
Mr.
interest
Sheedy,
rates.
do you know?
I don't, Senator.
I mean, do either of you read the newspaper? Forbes magazine just estimated last week that the average credit card APR in your networks is 28.75%. Average. 29%, let's call it. 29%. It's nearly doubled in the last 4 years. That is astounding, absolutely astounding. And you just testified a second ago that you've got more than 50% profit margin, and yet your testimony here today is you can't possibly survive if there's any competition. How can that be true? How can that be true? You've got debt like we've never seen before in American history. Your profit margins are as high or higher than they've ever been. You have 80% of the relevant market in the credit card interchange fees that we're talking about, and yet you couldn't survive if there's any competition? What am I missing? That's not a rhetorical question. How is it that you can't do any better?
Senator, we like competition very much. As my colleague from Mastercard mentioned, we don't loan money to consumers. That's the job of the banks. I will say, as it relates to small business, we care very much. And the pandemic was difficult on small business more than anyone. In 2022, we lowered rates for 90% of small businesses in the United States. I also think that many of the security and the digital features that have been put in the network help small business.
Wait a minute, but wait a minute. My time is almost expired. I don't mean to interrupt you. I'm sorry to interrupt you. But hold on just a second. You've increased the swipe fees consistently in the last few years. You've raised them, even as your network has expanded, even as your profit margins have gone up. You've raised the swipe fees. And in terms of competition, you are paying competitors not to enter the market. The DOJ lawsuit says that you threaten retailers with staggering financial penalties. That's a quote, staggering financial penalties if they use a competitor, and you're paying Apple and Square and others not to compete in your market. You've got 80% market share, and you are paying off would-be competitors not to come into the market while you charge people like Mr. Callahan, who knows how much more than big entities like Walmart. I mean, this is just classic collusive monopoly behavior. And your testimony is you can't accept any more competition. I agree with one thing that my colleagues down the dais have said, which is that this is not a sustainable situation. It is not sustainable. This has to change. 1.17 trillion in debt, this has to change. And I'll just end with this, Mr. Chairman. I thought one of the best proposals that the President-elect Trump, made during his last campaign, his most recent campaign, was to cap the interest rates of credit cards. So we could do that. We could do this and that. I think it's a great idea. I don't know why 30%, 30% interest rate should be charged on debt like this. I don't understand it. And I don't understand why you won't accept the smallest modicum of competition when it comes to these retailer fees. And I'm just here to tell you, this will not stand. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Hawley. Welch, Hawley, Durbin, Vance, what the hell's going on here? This is not only an odd couple, this is an odd grouping. The most conservative and the most liberal members happen to agree that we have to do something about this situation for Mr. Callahan, Mr. Cantor's clients, and so many others. Let me tell you where this started. It started in this very room in 2006. I wandered into a hearing of this committee that I knew nothing about on something on interchange fees. I didn't know what we were talking about. And there were merchants and retailers sitting at that table who had stacks of paper in front of them and said, this is my contract with Visa that describes what my interchange fee is, that dictates a major part of my expenses as a business. And I can't get the entire thing. They only give me part of it. And I can't understand what they send me. And I'm stuck with it. I take it or leave it. Visa or Mastercard say, you go along for the ride or you're going to get dumped. And we can't afford to walk away from it, as Mr. Callahan can't afford to walk away from it. And I asked the chairman at the meeting, I said, are we going to do something about this? I was incredulous. He said, we're going to do something about it. The answer is he didn't. And I started pursuing it with Mr. Swanson over here. And our idea at the outset was, let's at least get a study. Let's have somebody study this to see who's telling the truth and whether there's an answer to this situation. Well, the industry, Visa and Mastercard, went wild in anger at the thought of a study. Said no, we weren't going to have any study. And so I did something radical. On the banking reform bill, I introduced an amendment which regulated debit cards. It was an unusual regulation involving the Federal Reserve and God knows what. But it was a regulation on what the debit card fee would be. And to my great surprise and their amazement, surprise, and chagrin, it passed. It passed with 60, how many votes? 64 votes, 64. Dan tells me, on the floor of the Senate and went through the House without controversy. And that's the so-called Durbin Amendment 2010. And since then, we've had a chance to look and see what's happened in debit cards and what's happening with credit cards, and Mr. Callahan described that situation today. I don't agree with Senator Tillis that there's any zombies involved in this. I think these are real caring individuals. And I will tell you this, to Visa and MasterCard, you awakened a sleeping giant. The retailers and merchants across America have had it. They are fighting for survival in an inflation economy, and it ain't getting a break from you at all. No breaks at all. Take it or leave it. Still the same terms. So I agree with Senator Hawley. There reaches a point where the obvious question is, who's going to do something to help retailers and businesses across this country? I put a proposal on the table. Maybe Mr. Senator Tillis doesn't like it, but it talks about something called competition, for God's sake. Competition over this swipe fee. That's all we're asking for. Give the merchants another venue to process these fees that are coming at their way through Visa and MasterCard. I hope we do get inspired to do something about this. We've got a bipartisan force behind it. I thank the senators for being here today. I learned a lot too. And with that, the Senate Judiciary Committee stands adjourned.
When you talk about blackness and what happens in black culture, covering these things that matter to us, speaking to our issues and concerns.
This is a genuine people-powered movement.
There's a lot of stuff that we're not getting. You get it, and you spread the word.
We wish to plead our own cause Too long have others spoken for us. We cannot tell our own story if we can't pay for it. This is about covering us. Invest in black-owned media. Your dollars matter. We don't have to keep asking them to cover our stuff. So please support us in what we do, folks. We want to hit 2,000 people, $50 this month, raise $100,000. We're behind 100,000, so we want to hit that. Y'all money makes this possible. Checks and money orders go to P.O. Box 57196, Washington, D.C. 20037-0196. PayPal is R Martin Unfiltered. Venmo is RM Unfiltered. Zelle is Roland at RolandSMartin.com.